In any case, here's premise 2, and I want us to ask two basic questions about it. Question A, what do we mean when we talk about a society's distribution? And B, what distributions could everyone rationally accept? All right, so taking the first question first, when we're talking about a society's distribution here, we're really talking about the principles or institutions governing the distribution of what Rawls calls primary social goods. Right? Think of these principles as akin to parts of like the US Constitution, for example. Right? They should be thought of as first principles of the government or social order and the institutions that would embody or enforce such principles. Right? They're not just kind of everyday ordinary laws, they're things like kind of constitutional bedrock principles by which particular laws are judged or assessed. Right? These principles don't say which person should get which particular stuff. Rather, they tell us how certain kinds of things can or must be distributed among members of the society as such. Now, what are primary social goods? Well, here's John Rawls. He says, as a first step, suppose that the basic structure of society distributes certain primary goods. That is, things that every rational person is presumed to want. Right? These are the goods that normally have a use, whatever a person's rational plan of life. For simplicity, assume that the chief primary goods at the disposition of society are rights and liberties, powers and opportunities, and income and wealth. These are the social primary goods. Other primary goods, such as health and vigor, intelligence and imagination, are natural goods. Although their possession is influenced by the basic structure, they are not so directly under its control. Okay, so what we're interested in are these social primary goods, right? The things that are these goods that anybody can be presumed to want, no matter what kind of life they want to live, and they are things that are, as Rawls puts it, at the disposition of society. They can be distributed by, for example, governmental institutions or the economy. Okay, so things like rights and liberties, powers and opportunities, income and wealth. All right, so it's the distribution of rights and liberties, powers and opportunities, and income and wealth that we're going to be trying to reach rational agreement about. Now, you might think that those are very different things, right? For example, you might think that everyone should have equal rights and liberties, but you might also think that people should not all have equal wealth. Right? A number of you expressed that kind of view in your discussion posts from this week or from last week. Now, Rawls agrees with that, as we'll see in a moment, but I just want to put that complication aside for a moment so we can get clear on another set of important issues. So, what we're going to be looking at a lot today are these graphs. Okay, just simple graphs, the y-axis and the x-axis that you're familiar with from high school algebra and geometry and so on. Now, what these graphs are going to represent is if you look down at the x-axis, the horizontal one, each point on the x-axis is a person, right? Is a member of society. All right, but the y-axis is different. Each point on the y-axis represents an amount of primary social goods, right? The primary social goods like we just talked about, rights and liberties, powers and opportunities, income and wealth, right? You can have more or less of these, and the y-axis represents particular amounts of these. And the higher you go on the y-axis, the more primary social goods we're talking about. So here's how this works more specifically. So consider John and Anne, just two random people that I've now labeled on the x-axis. What the dots on the graph, what the points on the graph represent are the amount of primary social goods that John and Anne have, respectively. Right? In this example, John has more primary social goods than Anne by 4 units. What are these units? Don't worry about it, but they represent kind of more or less primary social goods had by the person at that point on the x-axis. Right, now I'd like you to get comfortable with these graphs as quickly as possible, just like you got comfortable with our utilitarian graphs where we talked about intrinsic value and disvalue. All right, because we're going to look at a lot of these today. All right, so when we're trying to reach rational agreement about society's distribution, what we're basically doing is comparing principles that generate different such graphs, right? Graphs like we just looked at. So to give you a fuller idea about how this works, consider the following four examples. So again, on the y-axis for these four graphs, you have primary social goods, here abbreviated with PSGs. And on the x-axis, you have people arranged in different ways. So if you look at the upper left, imagine that we rank everybody in society based on like how much effort they put in, say, at their jobs. All right. Now suppose also that there's like a smooth line where kind of everybody in society gives a little more or a little less effort at their job than everybody else. Okay, so that's what that first graph in the upper left represents. Now, suppose you think that the more effort you give at your job, the more primary social goods you should have, right? The more rights and liberties, income and wealth, and powers and opportunities you should have. Well, if you think that that's a just system, right, where more effort should mean more primary social goods, then you would think that the distribution represented by the graph in the upper left-hand corner is just, right? You should think that society is just in terms of its distribution, right? Or if you look to the top right, what you see is imagine we rank everybody in society by how many primary social goods they need, right? And imagine again that there's a smooth line where everybody needs a little bit more or a little bit less than everybody else. And suppose further that you think that primary social goods should be distributed on the basis of need, where the more you need, the more you should get, and the less you need, the less you should get. Well, then you're going to think that the distribution represented by the graph on the upper right would be just. Alternatively, right, go look into the lower left, suppose we think that amount of primary social goods people control should be based on how much stuff they produce, right? Stuff of social value. Okay? Now that's different, right, from both effort and need. And so imagine we rank people in terms of how much stuff they produce, and you think that primary social goods should be distributed on the basis of how much value one produces, then you're going to think the graph on the lower left represents a just distribution. Or, maybe a little bit differently from all of these three, suppose you think that how much primary social goods a person should get should be determined by how moral a person they are, how decent and compassionate and thoughtful they are. And suppose we rank everybody in society in terms of how decent they are, and we get this nice line where everybody's a little more or less decent than everybody else. Well, then if you think that that's the distribution, or that would be the just distribution, then you're going to prefer the distribution represented by the graph in the lower right. Okay, now these are all possible distributive principles we could choose, right? To each according to their effort, to each according to their need, to each according to their value produced, to each according to their morality, right? Now, if we did endorse these principles, they would be represented by the relevant graphs on the figures in front of you. Okay, hopefully that's helpful. Now, here's another very important option to determine distributive justice is the utilitarian option, right? You might think that what we ought to do is pick the distribution of those from which we can pick that produces the most net happiness. Now, suppose all of these little graphs here represent different distributions, as a result of different distributive principles. The utilitarian is going to say that the one we should choose, the just one, the one it's rational to choose, is the one that produces the most net happiness. Okay, so maybe it would be that one that was circled, although it's complicated here because happiness is not a primary social good. Right? Happiness cannot be distributed by, say, the government in the same way that wealth can, right? Or liberties can. So the utilitarian can't just straightforwardly pick the distribution of those available that produces the most primary social goods. Rather, they have to pick the one that produces the most happiness. And those might be a little bit different. But you think that there would be some correlation between how many primary social goods you control and how happy you are.